the period that we usually commemorate the Land Day. I will let you know a little bit more about why is the Land Day something so important in modern Palestinian history. But I don't think we should deal with the Land Day only as a historical event, because the main component of the Israel-Palestine conflict is land. And all the issue of land has been very important player in our conflict before the Nakba of 1948, after the Nakba form and of 1948. In 1976, I will tell you exactly what happened to put things in context, but we should not be dealing with the Land Day Yom al-Ard only as one historical event happening at the end of March 1976. And we are doing a lot of activities all over commemorating the Land Day. And we cannot start our talk without telling you what was said now a few hours ago by the current Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, who built his political career in the settlements. He was the CEO of the settlers for a long time. This man is now a prime minister. There is political tension and violence in Israel-Palestine. Few things has happened. The prime minister of Israel said to the public that he knows that a lot of Israeli citizens are carrying weapons, legal weapons. They have license. And this is the right time to carry the weapons, giving them a green light to carry on their weapons and kill Palestinians whenever they think that there is something dangerous from their point of view. This is now Israel. The Land Day, also then, the Israeli state was very violent towards the Arab Palestinian population. First of all, before we get to the Land Day, 1948, the most important event in modern Palestinian history, the Nakba happened, where there was ethnic cleansing. After the ethnic cleansing, we see what happens in 1948 as the biggest armed robbery of the 20th century. The modern Israeli state was built on the ruins of the Palestinian state and Palestinian people. After the war, in a sudden, the different Zionist movements, settler colonial projects, had a huge amount of land and property. They wanted to confiscate this land, so they started doing different ways to legalize the armed robbery. One of the most important laws is called the absentee law that helped Israel confiscate the big numbers of land in Palestine. But still, also after that, in the 1950s, the Arab Palestinians who were still considered Israeli citizens. Still, in the big issues, the Jewish state deals with us as enemies, not as citizens. So in the land issue, they were all the time planning for us as enemies. Between 1948 and 1966, 20% of the population in Israel, considered legally citizens, were put under military control. A state that its image, it's a democracy, was putting 20% of its population, citizens, under military control. This military control helped the state of Israel confiscate a huge amount of land from Palestinian citizens' hands in the 1950s and 60s. Only in the 1950s, numbers are nearly 1 million dunams that were confiscated. Big numbers also in the 1960s. The society that passed the Nakba was terrified, and they were put under military control. So their struggle existed, but was quite silent struggle. Very big change happens in 1976. Again, the state of Israel in the Galilee area wanted to confiscate something like 23,000 dunams from the area between Deir Hanna, Sakhnin, and Arab. 3 Arab villages. People went to protest against these racist policies. The state of Israel again reacted in huge violence towards the demonstrators. 6 people were killed, a lot of people were injured, and a lot were imprisoned. This act at the end of March 1976 was the first time that the Arab Palestinian minority goes out in the streets in big numbers protesting against this confiscation of land. Of course, before that, people were struggling all the time. But this was the biggest historical event that big numbers of Arab Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel going out on the street protesting against land confiscation. The state reacted in huge violence. This date became very famous. What made it very important in modern Palestinian history is that in the good time, the Students' Union, the Shehadeh al-Palestinian, was doing much better than what's happening nowadays. Of course, lately, there are great Palestinian students doing great activity all over, but at that time, it was much more organized. The Students' Union at that time started commemorating the Land Day all over the world. There were commemorations in Europe at that time, big numbers, but also in all of the Arab world. And then in Palestinian universities, the Land Day became the first historical event to be commemorated after the Nakba. That was starting from within the Greenland, within the Israeli-Palestinian citizens. Before that, there were things that were more violent, like Majdarat Kufur Qasim, but that happened in 1956. The Palestinian community at that time and the Palestinian people were not organized enough, so people knew less about it. The Land Day became something very important, and because of the continuous racist policies that got to do with land, every year when we commemorate the Land Day, we relate it also to what's happening nowadays in the present with issues that got to do with land. So probably those who are watching the news knows what's going on lately in the Sheikh Jarrah or other parts of East Jerusalem, or in the Naqab Desert with the Bedouin community there. All these big issues are issues that got to do with land. So this year, for example, لجنة المتابعة العليا inside the Green Line decided to do the big 2 events, one in the Naqab last Saturday, and today they are commemorating it in the historical and what it all happened between Sakhnin and Arabe, with their Hanna, so are going to be big marches, and part of it has already started. So there's commemoration all the time. Now, the issue of the Land Day could not be taken out of the general context. And the general context is that the Zionist project, we deal with it as a settler colonial project, happened in Palestine in an area that had a very, very small Jewish minority. And when Zionism started, the Jews were nearly 5% of the population in historical Palestine. The most important goal of the Zionist project was to build a Jewish state, not a democratic state, not a binational state, not a political entity that can deal with all of the people who were living in that area. The main goal was then and still going on was to build a Jewish state. Now, how could you build a Jewish state in an area that had a vast Arab majority? There are 2 ways to do it. It happened also in other settler colonial projects, okay? Like it happened in North America or Australia or Canada. You kill as much as you can from the indigenous people in order to have a big majority. or you do the ethnic cleansing like it happened in Palestine. They wanted to be a majority. It did not work by immigration. They didn't have any other options. Now I know about all this discussion between the historians, if the expulsion of the Palestinians were planned or not planned, a Dalit plan was. I think that all this is irrelevant. It couldn't work differently. If your main target is to build a Jewish state, not a different kind of political entity, a Jewish state in an area that has vast majority Arab Palestinian population, it could not end without a catastrophe. And it's continuing. Now, this is our biggest challenge with Israel as a Jewish state. My party, Balad Party, التجمع الوطني الديمقراطي, we think that Jewish democracy, and two words that do not go together. We see this thing as an oxymoron. We don't think that a Jewish state, in our case, could be theoretically a democracy. Because this is a political entity that says from the beginning, it's not that you guess, it's not hidden, it says very clear that Israel wants to see itself either as a Jewish state or the state of the Jewish people. It makes it a very, very special case. It's the only case in the world where the majority of your citizens are citizens in potential. Israel is a state for a lot of people who are not its citizens. The majority are living not within the state. But in the same time, it is not the state of all its citizens. And it says from the beginning, they prefer, there are different kinds of citizenships inside this political entity. There's supremacy to one race. And in order to be full citizen, you should be born to the right race. You can't earn citizenship like in a normal democracy. To have the A class citizen, you should be a Jew. Otherwise, it does not work. Then there are different classes of Palestinian citizenship. There are people like me who are living as citizens in the state of Israel. We can vote, we can be elected. I'm a member of the Knesset. But my people don't have the right to return. I am not allowed to be in love with someone from Ramallah and marry her. This is the last law we voted against before I came here to the state. There's a new law in Israel. It's not that new. Since 2003, we were able to drop it in July 2021. Now they brought it back. It's a law that want to decide to the Palestinians with whom are they allowed to get married and be in love. A law that says I'm not allowed to love someone from Jenin, Ramallah, Nablus. She was born for this, from the law point of view, she was born to the wrong race. My Jewish neighbor, nobody would dare to tell him with whom to be in love. He can decide from Australia, from the States. But for me, because I was born to the wrong race, the states want to get involved with whom I am allowed to get married or not. Now I can get married, but she will not be a citizen. She will not have the basic rights. You can't live inside a modern state without citizenship and papers. And there are other laws. Now, for this, we established the Balad Party. The Balad Party says, as long as Israel wants to see this itself as a Jewish state or the state of the Jewish people, this political entity would never be a democracy because it can't bring equality between all the citizens. And it's very clear, no equality, no democracy. Now, we also have a solution for this. We say that this political entity should change into a normal democracy. We call it the state of all its citizens. We did not invent anything new. It's not a creative solution. What we are wanting to do is to change the state of Israel from a Jewish state to a normal democracy that will deal with all the citizenship on the same base of justice and equality for all. Now, if you pray like a Jew, you pray like a Christian, you're an atheist, your problem between you and God. The state will not be giving you your rights according to your religious identity or any other identity. Citizens will be equal according to their citizenship. Because we believe in justice and equality for all, in the Israeli political system, the ballot people are considered the most extreme in the Israeli political system. And each election, they try to prevent us from going to the election. We established the party in mid-1990s. Every election in Israel, those who prepare for the elections, an election committee, it is built on Knesset members. It's not a professional thing, it's a political thing. Each time, because we want to struggle for justice and equality for all, this idea looks too extreme for the vast majority parties in the Israeli Knesset. So they ban us in the elections committee from going to the elections, then we go to the high courts. In the high courts all the time, there are discussions. I remember in one of the discussions, the judge asked the state attorney lady, why do you want to prevent this party from running into the elections? She told him, Your Highness, these people are struggling for full equality. The judge was shocked. He didn't know how to deal with it. Well, lady, you know, you are representing the state here. I can't ban them because they are running for and struggling for full equality. Then, of course, they started accusing us of supporting terror and so on in order to justify their act. But usually we go to the high courts and then we get back to run in the elections. In the last 2 decades, with this I'm going to finish my talk, then we can have questions and whatever you like. In the last 2 decades, the Israeli society and the Israeli political culture deteriorated very fast towards right, extreme right, and fascism. It was a project led by the settlers since mid-1980s by Kushimoni people and others to control all the important decision-making places inside the state of Israel. At the beginning, they were running to the places that the old elites didn't want to be part of. Later on, they controlled most of the ministers in the Israeli state. Lately, they have also the prime minister coming from the settlers project. There is total control for the settlers in everything. You can see it in the public political culture. You can see it in the polls. You can see it in the political behavior. You can see it in the political discourse of the different Zionist parties and who are inside the Knesset. You can see it all over. This thing is making it very difficult to struggle for justice and equality in this part of the world. This is why in the balance of powers on land in historical Palestine, there's a huge gap between our power and the vast majority Jewish power. In order to do a change, which is not becoming as a result of violence acts or anything else, in order to be a peaceful change, a change that will bring more justice and equality for all, the international pressure on the state of Israel is very crucial. Changing from within the Israeli society, it never happened before in such big numbers that racist societies would change without serious, good reason to do the change. Israel is not paying any price for its racism. Now, lately, there is something promising happening in the last 2 years. It's very important. All the reports that were published that talks about Israel as an apartheid state. starting from El Haq work in Ramallah, then B'Tselem, an Israeli NGO that works for human rights in the occupied West Bank, that also wrote a report that deals with Israel as an apartheid state. After B'Tselem, we had a very important big report of the Human Rights Watch. After that, another very important report by Amnesty. When I was here in my second week in the tour, I did not read it yet, but I heard about another very important report coming out of the law school in Harvard University. Not all the law school, no. Small human rights clinic inside the law school in Harvard University. And another few days ago, another independent report that came out of the UN. There is change. It's much slower than what we, the Palestinians, would have wanted, but it's happening. It's happening, it's important. I know about a lot of activities in the different campuses all over the world. There is a change in the public opinion in Europe, a little bit in the States. So this international work is crucial for those who would like to see a better place in Palestine and the historical compromise that would be built on justice, equality, and human rights for all. Of course, it's going to be a long process. One of our problems is that the Oslo Agreement has brought an illusion that the conflict has ended, and it's just a matter of some details that Dr. Saib Ariqat, Allah yarhamu, should close, and then everything will be okay. We are not in that situation. We are very far from there. It's going to take time. And also, time is not important if we don't do anything. So it's very important to continue the work on the international level. Thank you very much for your patience. Now, questions, remarks, anything you like.
So we have a few questions that we as a Students for Justice in Palestine chapter prepared. One that I wanted to bring up first.
Easy questions for me, hard questions for the students.
Okay, we'll see.
Yeah.
So you mentioned about how Israel employs apartheid against Palestinians, right? Different levels of citizenship, inability to marry across the Green Line and gain citizenship that way. Can you speak a little bit more as to how this apartheid is a tool of settler colonialism and land theft, how it helps them to expand the territory of Israel and steal more land?
Of course. In the Israeli case, racial separation is clear in everything. Most of the world don't know this, they don't talk about it, but 90% of the population living as Israeli citizens, Arabs and Jews, lives on racial separation. Arabs alone and Jews alone. All the big cities in Israel are 100% Jewish. Nearly 10% of the population lives, like me, in Yafa. We live in what is called mixed cities, where both sides of the conflict are sharing the same space, same neighborhood, same building. But also inside the 10%, there is racial separation within the mixed cities. For example, my children would go to a different school from my Jewish neighbors' children. There is separation in the education system. There is separation in the army. There is separation wherever you live. Another very important thing, the gaps between the two societies. You don't need a lecturer for that. You just drive your car inside the state of Israel, wherever you are. South, center, north, you would see alone whenever you are passing in a Jewish area and whenever you are passing in an Arab area. And not just for this, the Israelis usually has the racist explanation why there are so big gaps. So it usually goes, it is cultural issues. The Arabs are lazy. Arabs are more corrupted. But all this cannot explain also the gaps in the mixed cities, where the Jews were controlling everything since the Nakba. So if you go to an area in Illit or a Ramle, you see gaps between the Arabs and Jews living in the same city between the neighbors. So you can see it all over. Another important thing that proves the apartheid is the numbers that you check. Okay, now we are in the academy. It's a very important university here. We are nearly 19, 20% of part of the university and colleges. In Haifa, we are 40%, depends where. So we are well represented as students. Most enlightened thing in Israel is considered Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv University is a center of enlightenment. This center of enlightenment have on its board 13 people, 0 Arabs. I think 550 or a little bit more are on the Senate of the university. There are 1 Arab. Haifa's universities that have nearly 40% Arab students. On the board, there is 0 Arabs, and there are 3 out of 163 on the Senate. Bar Ilan University wanted to make us much easier life, so there's no Arabs on the board or on the Senate at all. But everything that you check inside the state of Israel and you do comparison, you see big numbers. Of course, there are things that, because of the settler colonial project, settlers never wanted to do the hard job. So they left us the economy of services. So we are represented quite good in what is called economy of services. But everything that you check, economically, socially, politically, you can see the gaps, and of course, it affects the lives of the Palestinian men. Another very important remark. The Israeli state do not acknowledge at all our national identity. So when I am telling you now that I'm a Palestinian, from the Israeli point of view, I am lying to you. There are no Palestinians. In the official narrative, there are no Palestinians. Surely not the 20% of Arab population living within the state of Israel. So the state also do not acknowledge our identity. This is why, for example, I was not allowed to teach Palestinian history when I was a history teacher. My children had to study modern Zionist history according to the Zionist narrative, and they are not allowed to learn Palestinian history. So you see this in everything that you check in the case of Israel. It's very easy to see the numbers.
Thank you so much. How do things like erasure of Palestinian history and the Palestinian identity, or denial of Palestinians' access to resources, how does it make it easier for settlers to confiscate land and to basically like continue the ethnic cleansing project, the Nakba?
Okay. In the case of Israel, I don't know how it's the case in the States. The state, because of its occupation in 1948, it controls 93% of the land. The Arab Palestinian minority that are nearly 20% of the population control maybe 3% of the land. Now we don't have land. Without land, you can't develop anything. So in order to develop any city or any village, you need industrial zones. Okay, imagine we have a community of 1.7 million people. We don't have one normal industrial zone inside the state of Israel. Now, of course, all of us works in the industrial zones in the Jewish areas beside our hometown. But because they control all the land, they plan the way they want. Now, the committee plans, numbers are like the numbers that I mentioned in the Israeli universities. For example, Israel is divided into different areas. If you check city planners and committee planning all over the state, in part of them we don't exist at all, like in the central area we don't exist at all, in Tel Aviv area we don't exist at all, in Jerusalem we have maybe 1 out of 40 something members of the committee of planning. I think we have 4 in Haifa out of 40 or 50. So in all the planning, we nearly don't exist. There are others, and because of this racist way the system is built, Both sides have serious problem in this. We got used that someone else is planning our present and future. So we don't do enough in order to become part of the system. And the system was got also used that the whole area, it's a Jewish state, Jewish planners, planning for everyone, looks totally normal. The process has been internalized by both sides, by the majority and by the minority. So it affects your life in everything on the daily basis. Last thing I'll tell you, in order to feel what I'm talking about, in Israel, there is a way you measure social economic standards of living. It's called the socio-economic cluster. It runs between 1 and 10. 1 is the lowest, 10 is the highest. 70% of our cities and towns are either on the second or the third level of the cluster. Between 7 and 10, I have 0. 0. Now, this is something that you can see. The numbers are quite clear, and you can read the statistics. It's very easy.
Thank you so much. And so, given that they use the Zionist entity uses apartheid as a tool of settler colonialism, but these human rights reports like Amnesty that you alluded to earlier are saying Israel is an apartheid state, and they don't mention settler colonialism. They say apartheid is the problem and we need to address that. Do you think that the international understanding of Israel as an apartheid state will develop into an understanding of Israel as a settler colonial entity that uses apartheid? And how can we bring that on, or how can we promote that?
You see, I studied history and political science. And historians don't like generalizations. And usually if they studied a case, it's usually something very unique, nothing could be compared of. There is a problem with using the apartheid discourse. Because it's not that. The Palestinian case is not same as South Africa. But if you use any definition for what could be an apartheid regime, Israel sits great in any of these definitions. Still, if the Zionists were satisfied with apartheid regime, they would not have needed ethnic cleansing. They could have controlled in Palestine as a minority. So it's not exactly what we know. There aren't a lot of cases well known for an apartheid regime in order to do serious comparison and so on. And there are some differences between Palestine, Israel, or South Africa, but also in the same time, there are some similarities. If we take any serious definition, if apartheid would mean, for example, that in the same area, the sovereign power have different legal systems. Israel sits great in this thing, because Israel controls the sovereignty all over historical Palestine. And there are different legal systems for different groups. The case in Gaza is different than all of them. It's the biggest prison in the world. So there is a different way to run Gaza. The Palestinians who are living in the West Bank, different case of occupied people in a state that do not acknowledge the occupation of all. Then you have another different case of nearly 300,000 people who are the Palestinians living as Israeli residents. Okay, they are not citizens. They are residents. They cannot vote, for example, but they have other rights. And then you have another case for the Palestinians who are considered citizens of Israel, like me. We have another different kind of legal system that gives us more rights than others of my people. And then you have another A-class citizenship for the Jews. Those who are in the West Bank as settlers or in Jerusalem, they have an A-class citizenship. But if this is apartheid. If there is anything that could be called apartheid, this is clear apartheid. But if you compare it only to the case of South Africa, there are differences. there are differences, serious differences. So it depends, and it's important in this case to see the definition. Now, settler colonialism discourse is new. It's less well known. It's mainly used in the last 2 decades, 15 years. Now there is much more serious scholars working on methodology to build a serious framework of thinking as a settler colonial project. It's new. It's working, it's developing very fast, it's important. I don't think that it could be either this or that. I think it could be both. But because of the power of the discourse that was developed against apartheid regime, I think it's very powerful. It's very important also to use this discourse. But the two things do not contradict in my point of view.
Specify the 300,000 people that have residence of Israel. Where do they live exactly?
The 300 people lives in East Jerusalem. And they are dealt with as a totally different group. This is not exactly the case of me, for example. These people, they are not allowed to vote for the Knesset. And they are allowed to vote for Jerusalem municipality, but they don't want to vote for Jerusalem municipality because then it means that they accept the occupation. According to the international law, they are occupied community. According to the international law, all of what is being done by Israel in East Jerusalem is illegal. Now, these people is suffering from a lot of important things. The most important thing that happened in the last few years was a discrimination wall that is separating them from the rest of the Palestinian people in the West Bank. Israel is trying to do facts on the ground. So he brought, and historically, the Palestinians in Al-Quds had very good relations to different parts of West Bank. The wall is separating them from that. And there are a few very racist laws. One of them is this citizenship law that I mentioned before that prevents them from getting married, for example, with someone from here. And there are also other laws. So the Palestinian case in East Jerusalem is different than the West Bank, Gaza, Palestinians inside the Green Line. I think one of the most important Israeli policies is to keep separation between the Palestinian people. In reality, in my point of view, it's not working. Okay, we saw what happened May 2021. The Palestinians have all over the world worked as a Palestinian people. But the Israelis will continue also putting a lot of efforts to keep separation between the Palestinian groups. Shukran, ya Sami.
So much.
Just a second.
So can you also talk about Land Day and what led up to the establishment of Land Day in 1976, and also its importance not only to Palestinians broadly, but to those such as yourself living in historic Palestine in the 1948 lands.
The Land Day started in the area which is considered occupied Palestine 1948. The land that I was talking about that should have been confiscated between Sakhnin, Arab, and Deir Hanna, March 1976, is considered inside Israel. The Land Day, as I said before, happened at the end of March 1976. It was people going out on the streets to protest, to demonstrate against land confiscation, which was not the first time or the second time or the third time after stealing all of the Palestinian land nearly in that area. People went out on the street to demonstrate. The state of Israel reacted in a very violent and By the way, nobody was accused of anything for those who were killed. When the Israeli state kills Arab citizens, nobody is held responsible. Same with Majzarat Kufur Qasim in 1956, when 49 Palestinians were killed by the Israeli soldiers. After going back from work to their home, they were massacred. Nobody was held responsible. Same with the 6 Shehadeh in Yom al-Ard. Same with the 13 Shaheed in the second Intifada in the October 2000 events. Same with, between the year 2000 and now, the Israeli police has killed nearly 70 Palestinian citizens in different occasions. Nobody is held responsible. Now, the importance of the land day is that at that time, we had a lot of serious students all over that started commemorating and using this event in order to talk about the Palestinian question. The land day was used all over the Arab world and Europe and part of the States much later in order to educate about the Palestinian question. So it became something very important on the international work of the Palestinians. And it is an occasion, it's a chance every year to go back and talk about Palestine and Palestinians and justice in this piece of the world. So it's an historical event that is very important every year to bring back to the minds of the people that there are Palestinians struggling against occupation, struggling against racism. And most of it was in things that got to do with land.
Did anybody ask for the prosecution of these?
Of course, all the time. Okay. Inside the Palestinian minority in Israel, there were political parties also. Now, we were not allowed to have our own Arab Palestinian political parties till 1984. This is why on the years of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, there was only one party allowed to represent us. It was the Communist Party, because it was Arab and Jewish political party. But the Palestinians inside the state of Israel, part of the apartheid regime of military control, we were prevented from having our political parties for Palestinian citizens that can represent themselves. But all these political parties all the time were struggling to hold these murderers responsible. It never worked. Why? When we talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict, this is not an old historical event. This is an ongoing conflict for a decade and for a century. And in order to keep the occupation, Israelis do crimes daily, every day. Of course, part of the crimes became more famous. Sometimes there is something bigger, so people talk about it. But only the fact that you want to keep millions of people under occupation, this is a continuous violent act happening daily. Now, if you want to hold part of the police responsible, they would ask, why are all the others not held responsible? Because there are there are violations of human rights all the time. Everybody is part of it. Okay, so the system will not allow holding responsible anyone, because then they will have to hold responsible all the others. This is why I think they are going to continue preventing this.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Something I also wanted to ask about. You live in a mixed community of Palestinian and Arab citizens and Israeli Jewish citizens. Can you talk more about the experience of Palestinians there? You mentioned it in your earlier speech, and also about the events that took place in some mixed cities during last May, during the uprising of dignity.
Yeah.
and how that's important as well. What is significant?
Okay. I'll separate my answer to this question in two parts. First of all, being a Palestinian living inside a mixed city, it depends a lot your personal experience on your political awareness. Now, for myself, I did research from the history of my city. I know the history of the place. Was something good. Jaffa was the most important Arab-Palestinian city before the war of 1940. Of course, Jerusalem is important as a religious center and everything, but Jaffa was the biggest city demographically, most important in the cultural activity, the richest, doing very good economically. My city, as a result of the Zionist project, was transferred into a small, poor, criminal neighborhood. Everything was Jewidized. Now we talked about planning. I live, for example, my address is 6 Rabbi Nachman Nebraslab Street. My brother lives in another Rabbi Street that nobody knows. Okay, the street that leads to us is called Chabad. Well, all of the names of the streets were Jewidized. Everything is like this in the public sphere. And they take it as something taken for granted. They don't see the problem in this. Now, inside mixed cities, there are points where people meet daily, and there are areas of racial separation. Areas of racial separation are the education system. People are separated in the kindergarten and the schools. Of course, what I am telling you is in general. On the margins, there are Arabs who register their children in Jewish schools, and there are some, and a few very, very small cases of binational schools, but totally marginal. In general, there is separation inside the education system. After the education system, of course, we will never want to go to the Israeli army that puts our people under occupation and destroy our life. So there is separation in the army. Then you have also separation in life. You know, in the States here, there are more intermarriages of Arabs, Palestinians, and Jews than in the mixed cities. So there are nearly no intermarriages. There is separation all over wherever you go. Still, there are also meeting points. And I'm living in my building. We are 7 families. 4 are Jewish, 3 are Arabs. My children and their children go to different schools, but we meet in the building, we meet in the street, we talk. When we talk, we use Hebrew. We know Hebrew because we must learn Hebrew in our school. They don't know Arabic because they don't have to learn Arabic. So if we talk in Hebrew. Now it depends if the Jews are religious, kosher things, and it brings them to certain way of living. So they are those who are secular. It's different. But you can also see separation according to race. Down my office, there's a street that leads to the seaport. It's called Yehuda Hayamim. In the same time, there were 2 coffee shops open. Okay, without planning it. The system is working without too much planning of racial separation. But what happened? 2 coffee shops, one is far from the other, maybe 100 meters. The first, which is closer to my office, has 90% Arab clients. The area is 50-50. Okay? 90% of his clients are Arabs because the owner was Arab. Then the Jewish owner, 90% of his clients are Jewish. People behave like this. And it's not for kosher issues. The Jews there are secular people. But then his audience consumes different food. So the menu is very different from the menu in the first coffee shop. And then you see also separation, 2 coffee shops opening in the same place. And then 2 communities are going. You see also their separation. People, of course, meet in the market because we are in the economy of services. So if you need anything to be done in your house, you probably will have an Arab worker. If you need to fix your car, probably you're going to need an Arab man. If you want to do all the economy of services, probably. But not just that, also I think 90% of the pharmacists in Israel now are Arab Palestinians. So if you go to the pharmacy, probably you are going to meet an Arab. There are areas of where people meet. And in general, there are separations. What happened May 2021 in the mixed cities? For this, I need to give you some historical background. With the disengagement from Gaza, at that time, Prime Minister in Israel was Ariel Sharon. Sharon decided that the settlements project in Gaza failed. He wants to bring the few thousands that are left out of Gaza. This thing was called the disengagement project. In this disengagement project, the leadership of the settlers were shocked. They did not believe that an extreme right-wing leader like Ariel Sharon will bring settlers out of settlements from Gaza. So they gathered and they said, in order to prevent anyone else to bring us out from the settlements in the West Bank, what should we do? They came with a project which is called To Settle in the Hearts. You can Google this. If you are studying about racism and colonialism, 19th century, you can see a living case nowadays Israel from the discourse. Now, the settlers were a problematic issue within the Jewish community inside the state of Israel. They made this project, which is called To Settle in the Hearts. And they say, there are two aims for this project. First of all, they want to build settlements inside the Green Line, not in the West Bank. The main work of the settlements will be, they call it to strengthen their Jewish partners, Jewish people living within the Green Line, strengthening them with national religious Zionist ideology. The second aim is, if next time any Israeli prime minister would dare to think to do anything against the settlers, they would do their demonstrations within the Green Line inside the heart of the state of Israel. In order to choose where to go, they said, okay, we have different disagreements with their Jewish brothers inside the state of Israel, but there is something that there's a Zionist consensus upon. And this thing is called the demographic bomb, which is we, the Arab Palestinians living as Israeli citizens. There's a kind of consensus inside the Israeli state that we are a demographic bomb. Now, as I told you before, 90% lives on racial separation, so they don't meet a lot this demographic bomb. Where do they meet a lot? In the mixed cities. So they decided to put their settlements inside our neighborhoods. So in the Ajami neighborhood, in Yafa, there is a settlement. In Lid, in Akka, in Haifa. Now, these people came with this racist ideology. Imagine people coming to your neighborhood from anywhere. And they were using the discourse of their main project is to live in clean neighborhoods. The fact that the neighborhood is mixed is described as a serious danger for the future of the Jewish people, which could, in a very, very crazy terminology. So they want to have clean kindergartens, clean schools, because our children is dead. Why do you need to clean it? Tel Aviv University, municipality makes the work of cleaning. Clean, yani clean from Arabs. Now these people comes to our neighborhoods having this kind of ideology. In the cases of Lid Akka, they were supported very high from the state, because also the state agrees that we are a demographic bomb. Why Lid and Akka? Because the Arabs, in the case of Lid and Akka, became third of the population. So this is too much. They can't bear it. They want to do a demographic change. So they supported the settlers coming to live in these areas. Now, when tension was very high and there were violence all over, Sheikh Jarrah, كل القدس, inside the Greenland and so on, people went out to demonstrate against all these racist scenes. The Israeli state again reacted in violence. The settlers inside the mixed cities was not satisfied with the violence that was used by the state. They wanted to join the Israeli army and police in the violence against us. So they said that they are attacked by Arabs and they need the help of their brothers from the settlements. Using social media, Telegram, WhatsApp, Facebook, they started getting organized in the settlements in the West Bank with a clear statement that they are going to teach the Arabs in the mixed cities a lesson. Now, these people are all of them trained in the army, they have weapons. In the case of Lot, for example, Lot was under siege. People were not allowed to go in and out at that time. Their buses were allowed in. Buses, not individuals. They took buildings of Lot's municipality to get organized there. Our great neighbors, in order to help them, it's a mixed area. So Arabs and Jews are living in the same area. To make it easier for the settlers to attack us, part of our neighbors went out and painted our houses in red spray in order to tell their fellows coming from the settlements, where do you have an Arab house and where do you have a Jewish? So the people got organized to defend themselves. It was very, very hard times, very hard times. People were really terrified because, and imagine you are a citizen in the state, you are attacked by the police. You don't have a weapon to defend yourself, and you have no one to go to talk to. Then also people from the citizens decide also to attack you, and you don't have where to go. So in the state of Israel, which all of the state is big army and security forces, in the mixed cities, our youth got organized in small groups, trying to defend the mosque, churches, or our houses. It was absurd at that time. Because we were organized and we were not allowed them to kill enough, so they went out after things became calm with the feeling that they did not win. Because of this feeling, there are all the time, since May till today, acts of getting revenge in the mixed cities. So all the time, the tension is very high in this part of Israel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're going to open up now to questions from anyone who wants to ask them. Ask. And we know that there are people with a lot of different backgrounds and understanding of what's happening in Palestine and the modern political history of Palestine. So we encourage questions, simple questions, complex questions, anything that you would like to ask. So yeah, floor is open. And anyone on Zoom, you can type in the chat if you have a question, and I'll speak it out loud.
If all of we are agreeing, it's great. Thank you.
There are some
La, Sami, let's hit others, and then if not, we hear you. No, thank you, sir. Just a minute. Others, any questions? Come beside me, help me to moderate this thing.
Yeah.
Please.
So you spoke about the relationship between the settlers and the Israeli security forces in the state and how they will cooperate to carry out violence. They're not two separate groups, but they work together. I was wondering if you could also speak to the connection of the United States to the Israeli state and the United States to the settler groups, and the way that this country provides support to these acts of violence and how we are complicit.
Okay. As I said before, Israel is a very special case because usually in different parts of the world, you have the military and you have civil society. Israel is a very militarized society. In Israel, all of the Jews, except the Orthodox religious ones, not all of them, okay, goes to the army, men and women. So there is no really clear difference between the civil society and the army. And the army is not there only for security issues. In Israel, in the army, you learn driving and they help you to get to the university. And it's most of the big investments in the economy and the high tech and the weapon industry. So the army is in everything inside the society. So there is no big difference. The settlers have very good relations to the army because settlement is a state policy. It's not individuals. You see, no individuals can go to a mountain beside Ramallah and Nablus and decide that this is theirs without the defense of the army. If you are defended by the army, it means that you are doing something for the state. So there is also no serious difference between state policies and settlements. Settlements are state policy. The huge money is government money. Where does the American come? First of all the crazy Americans that have fantasies about power, you see them in all the hard cases, in the hardcore settlements with their American English accent in nearby Al-Haram al-Ibrahimi in Hebron, for example, in all the very hardcore. So these people come, most of them are organized in Zionist organizations in the States, and they have good relations and they do a lot of fundraising in the States. Now, the official policy of the United States, not under Trump nowadays, okay, because it's different, that they are against settlements. But they don't want to do anything against settlements, and others also are not allowed to do anything against settlements. So you see all this legislation now they are talking about in the different states that you are not allowed to struggle against bringing products from the settlements. So in the result and in policies, what counts is the results. In the results, they are supporting settlements. Also, they are having good statements against settlements. In the results, they are doing so. Now, our issue is not just settlements with the states. We have huge blind support for Israel in the states. Usually people, when they talk about it, they talk about the Zionist lobby. I don't think that this is the main thing. We have two big things, which will build mainly on ignorance, in my point of view. There are two main reasons why Americans support Israel. First of all, there is this myth that they have in their mind that Israel is a microcosm of the American project. Europeans immigrating to a barbarian area and building a democracy in the only part of the Middle East and so on, with all its different stories. And another very important reason for Americans to is the religious Christian Zionist story that people really do believe. Now, for secular people, this is hard, okay, to believe that people think, but yes, people think in this way, that their personal salvation got to do with the success of the people of Israel going to the land of Israel. This is why the Zionist lobby has very fertile land to work in the States. It's easy for them to work. Now, in order to do a change, we should bring different story. We should bring another narrative to tell the people that things are not exactly the way they think they are. The truth is in a totally different place. This needs a lot of work. This needs a lot of work. And because we came very late, We have already started, okay, in the 1970s with a few Palestinian intellectuals. At that time in American universities, they were accused of being terrorists. People like Professor Ibrahim Abu Lughod, later on Sharabi, Said, all the others. Nowadays, it's a different situation. The students are doing also very good work, but we need to change very seriously the public opinion. It's not enough to publish a few books. It's very important, and a few reports. This needs a lot of work, because we are working in a situation that you need to change something. It's not that people don't know anything, and there are two narratives fighting on the public opinion. There is a very powerful narrative that exists on the minds of the people, and it's very hard to change something like that. It's not easy. So this is why it takes time. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you talked a little bit about what the segregation aspect looks like in mixed cities. Could you talk as well about what it looks like in terms of interaction between all of the youth there? So for example, if you have to, do how does youth avoid interaction when they can, and then when they do, they just speak in Hebrew and only talk like as much as necessary and then avoid talking about politics? Or how does that actually play out on a day-to-day scale and like between the two?
Thank you. In the mixed cities, there are a lot of different factors. Most important is demography. The Jaffa case is very different than others. The Jaffa case, the Palestinians in that area are 1% of the population. In Lid, it's different. In Akka, it's different. In Haifa, demography and geography plays important things here. That regarding where people are more separated or less separated, they mix or they don't mix, depends on demography and geography. Now, also, in all the cases, people, remember one of our intellectuals used to say, there is coexistence. Okay. The problem is not coexistence. The problem is there could be equal coexistence. Now we wake up every day in the morning, we say good morning to each other, we don't kill each other every day. We manage, sometimes we help each other. Neighbors once could get to the weddings of each other, funerals of each other. People meet and they interact. Okay? But still, in the minds of people, the majority of both sides deals with each other as an enemy. This is why, for example, in the 1948 war, most of the Japhans were expelled through the sea. It's a coastal area. Those who went south are in Gaza. Those who went north went to Lebanon. So we have very big numbers of Japhans living in Gaza. So when my state is fighting Gaza, they are killing our families. And 2 wars ago, when there was a big massacre in Farra family in Gaza, Farra family in Jaffa had a tent for the funeral. My neighbors cannot understand that I am struggling against the war. This is mainly because of the power of narrative. They are raised on a totally different narrative. And this narrative is so powerful that it prevents them from seeing us as a nation and for seeing our history and our rights. And they have also different psychological justifications for not relating to Arab. With all the things I am telling to you, there are on the margins very, 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 very small number people who have much more interaction. When I was on the municipality in Jaffa, Tel Aviv, I worked a lot to open a mixed school, bi-national school, that would teach in Arabic and in Hebrew. Alhamdulillah, till today it's working. It's considered a good success. But this is one school out of hundreds, okay? So there are also people who try to build things together. Also in our political party, there is a very, very, very small minority of Jews, great activists, We appreciate them a lot. They pay much higher price than I do because they are in my party, because they are considered traitors, because they struggle for equality and justice. So there are here and there people who do mix on the margins. There are some good, very good projects on these issues, but it's totally marginal also inside the mixed cities. Also inside the mixed cities. Allah Yafiq.
So you probably know that the political structure of Israel is built on apartheid and built on Jewish supremacy, including the parliament. And you probably also know about the 1977 law that prohibits any political party that is anti-Zionist to participate in the parliament. So how do you reconcile this structure with your project, which is in line with the Palestinian rule?
Well, this law is our main challenge every election. There's a law in Israel that says in order to run into the elections, you must acknowledge that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state, which totally contradicts our political philosophy. We built our party because we don't think that there is something that could be called Jewish democracy. We think it's an oxymoron. And we have different solutions. So every time we have to go in a very, how do you say, creative, legal discourse, explain to the high courts why our political agenda do not contradict exactly, clearly, this part of the law. But also at the same time, also if they did not have this law, okay? We work in a parliament which has a huge consensus against everything that we believe in. And we are accused all the time with different crazy things of supporting terror and working against the state of Israel, or we are considered extreme because we believe in democracy and human rights. It's a very complicated situation. It's not an easy situation for a Palestinian who sees himself part of the Palestinian movement, national movement, that you go daily to the Knesset. Who's my colleagues on the Knesset? I have Itamar Ben-Gvir 2 seats beside me and this side, different crazy ministers in front of me. You don't have much colleagues that you want to work with, but this is, meanwhile, this is the widest stage that we still have to work politics within the state of Israel, the Knesset. Otherwise, I don't think that I was now giving a talk in Chicago University or meeting congressmen or talking to the media. The fact that you are an elected leader is important for politics internationally. So we use this stage, but it's not the best. Yani, I wish it would have been better. But this is the situation. It fills our lives with daily contradictions. Every day we ask ourselves, why do we go there? But this is the political option that we have chosen. We are working with all the contradictions. Shukran.
Anything else?
I tell you something to read if we are finishing and we don't have more questions.
Yeah, we're finishing soon, so that's fine.
So, okay, I'll give you something to read in order to feel that I did it in the right academic way. Okay, it's never enough in a few minutes to bring the people into the complexity of the life of Palestinians living within the state of Israel. There's a very good book published by Mada Research Center from Haifa. It's called Palestinians in Israel, History, Culture, and Politics by Professor Nadim Rouhana. Rouhana is written Rouhana, and Dr. Arish Sabbagh. It's a very good textbook, very good introduction that gives you a lot of background and important information. By the way, there's a very good article there on the Land Day and other historical important events that happen. And there is also about the legal system and racism. It's a very good work. Different Palestinian scholars. I think there are also Israeli participants. Nice volume. It's on the net. You can have it as a PDF on the net. So Rouhana and Sabah, Palestinian citizens in Israel, it's a very good thing to start from. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Okay, everybody, thank you so much.